What if I told you that you're not the one using words, but that words are actually using your life? What if the true reason your reality doesn't change isn't a lack of faith or effort, but the way you speak daily without realizing it? Since childhood, we were taught that speaking was just about communicating ideas, but the most ancient teachings reveal something far more unsettling. Words don't describe reality, they create it. Jesus didn't speak to explain the world, he spoke and the world obeyed. In this video, you're going to discover why his words held real power, what the Logos truly is, and how to learn to speak from that same place of inner authority where the invisible begins to take form. There is one revelation, just one, that can transform the way you speak forever, and you'll only understand it if you feel this message arrives at the exact right moment. Write palabra despierta in the comments now. And if, as you listen, you feel this teaching touches something deep within your soul, you can support this living energy with a super chat as a conscious act of exchange and spiritual gratitude. Because when the word awakens reality, there was a time long before words became mere tools of communication, long before language was reduced to code, to contract, as a tool for negotiation or persuasion, knowledge, where uttering a word was considered an act of creation as serious and as sacred as sowing life on earth. It wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't religious poetry meant to console those who couldn't access the truth. It was direct knowledge, passed from initiate to initiate, guarded with the same care as one guards the fire when the cold can kill. In the temples of ancient Egypt, priests initiated into the mysteries of the word, spent years in silence before being allowed to utter certain sounds in certain spaces. They didn't first learn grammar, vocabulary, or rhetoric. They learned to vibrate, to feel the resonance of a sound in the body before releasing it into the air. They learned that the voice is the bridge between the inner world and the outer world, and that this bridge cannot be built with false materials or with the architecture of fear. They observed their breathing for entire months. They refined their intention with the precision of someone tuning a sacred instrument, because they understood with a clarity that the modern world has almost and completely lost, that the word is not born in the mouth. The mouth is only the last place where the word becomes audible, but its origin is much deeper. The word is born in consciousness, is born in that space where the being you are meets the reality you inhabit, where intention becomes frequency before it becomes sound. The wise Hebrews, who guard one of the oldest traditions of understanding sacred language, studied each letter of the alphabet as if it were a living spark torn from the original fire of creation, not as an abstract symbol representing a sound, but as a real force, as an active channel through which the intelligence that sustains the universe can flow into the material world. For them, letters didn't describe reality, they built it. And when, in the oldest texts of that tradition, it's recounted that creation began with a word, with a sound, with an act of speech that separated light from darkness and order from chaos, they weren't crafting a symbolic story to explain the inexplicable to simple minds. They were preserving in narrative form a cosmological truth that quantum physics is only just beginning to touch upon from its own edges, that reality, at its most fundamental level is vibration, and that consciousness, vibrating with clear intention, doesn't describe that vibration, it initiates it. Greek philosophers, especially those who drew from the same sources of Egyptian and Eastern wisdom that nourished all the great traditions of the ancient world, named this a force with a word that in their language simultaneously captured meanings that in no other language could be brought together in a single syllable. Logos. It wasn't just a word in the sense of articulated sound. It was the intelligent order underlying all existence. It was the reason that holds galaxies in their orbits without needing calculation. It was the intelligence that makes the hearts of millions of beings beat without anyone having to remember. It was the force that moves the wind and that organizes DNA and that allows two strangers on opposite ends of the planet to have the same dream on the same night. The Logos was the language of reality speaking to itself. And then a man appeared in whom these two currents, the Hebrew tradition of the creative word and the Greek understanding of the Logos as the universe's organizing principle, converged in a way previous master had embodied so completely. That man not only intellectually understood the power of the word, he inhabited it. He lived it from the inside out in every moment of his existence. When Jesus spoke, he didn't do so as someone who uses language to persuade others that his ideas are correct. He didn't speak to convince. He didn't argue. He spoke, he declared. He spoke with the authority of someone who isn't asking reality to change, but reminding reality of its true order. And reality responded with the obedience that comes from recognition, not the obedience that comes from fear. This knowledge about the true power of the word was not destroyed over time. It wasn't lost in the fires of ancient libraries, nor in the wars that erased entire civilizations. It was hidden, carefully preserved in forms that only those with ears ready to listen could recognize. Kept in texts that seem to speak of history but actually speak of cosmology. Protected in traditions that seem like empty rituals, but are actually maps of an inner technology, waiting with the patience that only eternal truths possess for those who are ready to receive it. Because a human being who genuinely understands the power of their word is a human being who can no longer be governed by the narrative of fear. It's someone who has reclaimed their role as a conscious creator instead of remaining a passive spectator of a destiny that seems to come from outside. And that kind of freedom, the radical freedom of someone who knows their voice, actively participates in shaping their reality, is the most feared and most persecuted freedom throughout all of human history. You have spoken your entire life, even before you had words. You were already emitting sounds filled with intention, hunger, fear. Since you learned to articulate syllables, language became your primary tool for navigating the world. And over the years, you accumulated a vocabulary, a way of naming things, a way of describing what happens to you and how you relate to what's around you. Millions of words spoken over decades. And yet, if you stop for a moment and are completely honest with yourself, there's something painful to admit because it contradicts all the effort you've invested. There are changes you declared with conviction that never materialized, promises you made to yourself that were repeated in different versions throughout the years without the outcome being any different. There are affirmations you regularly repeat phrases filled with positive intention, words carefully chosen to attract what you desire, and yet the anxiety continues to live in your chest, comfortable in the knowledge that no one will ask it to leave. And that creates a specific wound, different from ordinary pain, because it carries an inherent dimension of self-distrust. The feeling that your words don't have the power they should, that something in you is broken or incomplete, or not spiritually advanced enough to access that strength that others have clearly found. And that feeling of spiritual deficit is in itself one of the most powerful mechanisms keeping the cycle intact. But the truth about why words don't work as they should is much more precise and much more liberating than any diagnosis of inadequacy. It's not that your words are weak. It's not that your faith is lacking. It's that in most cases, they've been spoken from the wrong identity. There exists in every human being an inner architecture composed of multiple layers that are not always aligned with each other. The surface, the level where conscious thoughts form and deliberate words are chosen, is only the thinnest and most recent layer of that architecture. Beneath it are layers, much older, formed long before you had the vocabulary to describe them or the awareness to question them. Layers that were shaped by the earliest experiences, by the messages you received before you could distinguish what was taught to you about who you really were. And those deeper layers have their own language, their own belief system, their own set of truths about what is possible for you, about what you deserve, about how the world works. When you say with your mouth that everything will get better, while those deeper layers whisper from their place of ancient conviction that it's not possible for someone like you, you're not sending a clear signal. You're sending two contradictory signals at the same time. And in that internal conflict, in that silent war between what you want to believe and what on some deeper level you truly believe, the oldest layer almost always wins. Not because it's more true, but because it's older, it's more ingrained, and has had more time to build the architecture of evidence that confirms it. Every time you say, I don't have money, or I can't, or the same thing always happens to me, you're not simply describing a temporary situation. You're doing something much more serious without being aware of it. You're sealing that situation with the language of permanence. You're instructing your nervous system, your perception, your energy field to organize subsequent experience in a way that confirms that statement, because the system that processes internal language doesn't distinguish between description and creation. It doesn't have a filter that says, this is just a momentary observation, don't take it as a directive. It takes everything as instruction, takes everything as information about what's real and what you should expect. The real spiritual problem in our relationship with words isn't a lack of faith understood as intellectual belief. It's the incoherence between different levels of being. It's the distance between conscious intention and unconscious convictions. It's the fact that most people live in a state of permanently contradictory internal dialogue, where one voice says, go forward, and another voice says, be, and another voice says, what's the point? I already tried. And another voice says, but this time it'll be different. And in that constant background noise, there's no room for any individual word to have the force it needs to move anything in the field of reality. And the cruelest aspect of this situation is that the conscious effort to utter more positive phrases without first addressing the deep inconsistency not only doesn't solve the problem, but in some cases, it deepens it, because it adds a layer of guilt to the cycle, because it makes you believe the problem is that you're not being positive enough, that you're not repeating the right phrases enough times, that there's some technique you haven't mastered yet. When the real solution isn't on the surface of words, but in the quality of being from which those words emerge. In the prologue of the most philosophical gospel, among those that make up the Christian canon, there's a phrase that for 2,000 years has been repeated in churches, memorized by believers, quoted by theologians, debated by philosophers, and yet largely remains misunderstood in its most radical dimension. In the beginning was the Logos. Not in the beginning was faith. Not in the beginning was prayer. Not in the beginning was will or merit or grace granted to the chosen. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and the Logos became flesh. This progression isn't just theology. It's a cosmological map of how reality organizes itself from its most fundamental level to its most concrete expression. The Logos, that ordering intelligence that precedes all manifestation, that sustains the structure of the universe before there are particles to observe, that organizes chaos into cosmos before there's a human mind to name it. That Logos is the origin of everything. And the most radical assertion of the text isn't that this Logos existed before. The most radical assertion is that this Logos became flesh, that this primordial intelligence chose to incarnate, to dwell in a human body with all its limitation and its vulnerability and its subjection to time, that the highest and the deepest of the cosmic order found complete expression in the most ordinary and most fragile form of existence. And when that incarnate Logos spoke, when that man in whom the intelligence of the universe had become fully present opened his mouth, what came out of it was not the voice of an individual formulating desires or expressing opinions. It was the language of order itself, reminding disordered reality of its essential nature. When Jesus stood before a storm and said, "Be still," he wasn't addressing agitated water molecules hoping his request would be considered. He was declaring the original order that underlies every appearance of chaos. When he stood before death and said, "Arise," he wasn't defying the laws of nature from the position of someone with enough power to violate them. He was recognizing a truth that on the deepest plane of existence had never ceased to be true, that life is the most fundamental reality, that death is the phenomenon and life is the principle, and that whoever speaks from that recognition is not asking for a miracle, but naming what is already true in the dimension that precedes visible manifestation. Here is the revelation that completely transforms how we understand the power of the Word. Jesus didn't speak with power because he had access to some external source of supernatural energy that the rest of human beings cannot reach. He spoke with power because he was coherent, because there was no distance between what he said and what he was, because his identity, the understanding of who he was in relation to the Logos, was so completely integrated into his being that every word he uttered emerged from that place of unity without passing through the filters of fear or doubt or the need for approval. He didn't speak from the ego that needs to defend itself. He didn't speak from the wound that needs to compensate itself. He didn't speak from the fear that needs to protect itself. He spoke from the Logos, from that inner point where the separation between the speaker and what is spoken to disappears, where there is no distance between intention and manifestation, where the word and reality are not two distinct things that need to be brought into contact, but two aspects of the same movement, of the same intelligence, expressing itself through two simultaneous channels. And there, in that understanding, lives the revelation that truly changes everything. For whoever receives it, not as intellectual information that can be stored alongside other interesting facts, but as recognition, as the moment when something you always knew but which had been covered by layers of conditioning and forgetting reemerges to the surface with the quiet strength of what never ceased to be true. That potential, that ability to speak from the Logos, to utter words from a place of such profound coherence that reality cannot ignore them, is not exclusive to Jesus, nor to any enlightened master in history. It is the heritage of every conscious being. It is what you are in your most essential nature before fear, conditioning, and personal history built up the entire architecture of identity that you believe you are today. It's not something you need to develop from scratch. It's something you must remember. And there's a huge difference between those two words. Develop implies effort. It implies the absence of something that needs to be created. It implies a long path of acquisition. To remember implies return. It implies that what you seek already exists within you. It implies that the task is not to build, but to clear, not to add, but to recognize what was never absent. What you're about to explore now is not a set of techniques designed to manipulate reality through correctly executed verbal formulas. It's not the spiritual equivalent of a magic trick. It's a process of alignment, a way to bring the different levels of your being, from the most superficial to the deepest, into a coherence that allows a word, when it leaves your mouth, to come from a place of unity instead of from the noise of internal contradiction. The primary driver of this process is silence, and true silence is much more demanding and much richer than the word suggests. It's not the absence of external sound. It's not simply turning off the music and closing the door. It's inner silence, the state in which the thoughts that normally fill every space available to consciousness are observed rather than followed, recognized rather than obeyed, allowed rather than fought. Because fighting with thoughts to achieve silence is exactly like stirring pond water to make it clear. The water only clears when you stop moving it. Silence only emerges when you stop chasing it and resisting what prevents it. Sit in a place where you can be completely present, not comfortable in the sense of sleepy, but comfortable in the sense of not distracted, with your spine able to naturally lengthen with your body not having to hold any posture that requires. Close your eyes, not to escape the outer world, but to direct all your attention towards the inner world, which normally doesn't receive the same quality of observation. Observe the thoughts that appear without following them. They are like clouds in a sky that doesn't change because the clouds are there. The sky is the witness. The clouds are the content. You are the sky, and gradually, without you having to do anything to produce it, something begins to change in the texture of your inner experience. A space opens that wasn't accessible when the mind was in its usual mode of continuous production. A silence that is not emptiness, but presence. That is not absence, but a fullness different from all the fullness you know. That silence, that space of pure presence, is the ground from which powerful words grow. It's the womb of the Logos, because words that change realities aren't born from calculating thought, nor from longing desire, nor from pressing will. It's born from the silence that recognizes. The second movement is the recovery identity, not the identity constructed through personal history, not the name and role and the set of characteristics and habits and stories that constitute the character the world knows by your name, but the identity prior to all that, the consciousness that observes your history without being trapped in it, the presence that has accompanied every experience of your life from the first until this precise moment, the one that was there when you were 5 and when you were 20 and when you were at your lowest and when you were at your highest, that presence, constant and unchanging, that is the witness to everything you've lived, but wasn't reduced to any of those experiences. Ask yourself the question that masters of all traditions indicated as the entry to this territory. Who am I when I stop identifying with everything I think I am? Don't look for a conceptual answer. Seek the direct experience of the one who asks, and you'll discover something that cannot be fully captured in words, but that can be fully recognized in the experience, that there's something in you that just is, without having to prove anything, without having to achieve anything, without having to convince anyone of anything. That presence is the channel of the Logos. It's the point of contact between your individual being and the intelligence that organizes the universe. The third movement is the declaration, and there's a qualitative difference, huge, between declaring and wishing. Wishing speaks of absence, of distance between the one who wishes and what is wished for, of a present reality that is unsatisfactory and of a future reality that doesn't exist yet. Declaring speaks from existence, from the recognition of a truth that is real on a deeper plane, even if it's not yet visible on the plane of ordinary experience. Don't say, "I want to heal," while your body remains tied to the story of illness. Say, "Life flows in me now from the place where that is already true, where vitality is your essential nature before any symptom." Don't say, "I wish things would change," from the position of someone who doesn't trust that change is possible. Say, "My reality orders itself from the inner truth from the recognition that order is the fundamental nature of existence and disorder is always temporary and always superficial. Pronounce these declarations with a slowness that is not artificial but genuine, the slowness that indicates that every word is felt before it's spoken, the pace of someone who knows that what they're saying matters, like someone planting a seed, not by throwing it in the air, but by placing it carefully, exactly where the earth can best receive it. The fourth movement, and the most demanding of all, is lived coherence, because the word most powerful you can utter in a moment of conscious practice will be completely dismantled by the 100 unconscious words you utter the rest of the day from the usual place of reactivity, fear. Lived coherence means that the alignment you achieve in moments of deliberate practice begins to filter into the ordinary moments of life, that the way you speak to the cashier at the supermarket begins to have the same quality of presence as the way you make your sore sacred declarations, that the words you use to describe your current situation begin to be chosen with the same awareness you'd use to pick seeds for a garden you want to flourish, that what you say about yourself, about others, about the world begins to come out from a deeper part of you than the part that simply reacts to what happens. This isn't achieved overnight. It's a process of training your attention, of recalibration, gradual shift in the point from which you speak. But every time you practice it, even if it's just for an instant, even if it's in a single conversation or a single phrase that you choose more carefully than usual, you're exercising that muscle of coherence that makes the word stop being just sound and genuinely start to be creation. When you learn to speak from the logos, when the alignment between your different levels starts to be genuine and not just performative, the first territory where changes become perceptible isn't the outer world, it's your own inner self. And it's important to understand this well, because many people who seek the power of the word primarily look for it as a tool to change external circumstances, to attract prosperity or relationships or recognition, and they get discouraged when those changes aren't the first to appear. The deepest and most lasting changes happen within, and internal changes are what eventually reorganize everything else from a depth that no superficial manipulation of circumstances could achieve. Your mind starts to function with a different kind of clarity. Not the forced clarity of someone who's had enough sleep or enough coffee, but the organic clarity of a system that's no longer using most of its resources to sustain internal contradictions. When the different levels of your being speak the same language, when there's no silent war between what you say and what you believe, a mental energy is released that was previously completely consumed in that conflict, and that liberated energy manifests as a finer perceptive ability, as the skill to see connections you didn't see before, as a kind of peripheral clarity that allows you to perceive options that previously remained outside the range of what you considered possible. Your body also responds in concrete and verifiable ways. The chronic tension that resides in so many bodies as a permanent residue of inner incoherence, that stiffness that settles in the neck and shoulders and abdomen and jaw, as if the body were perpetually ready to defend itself from something, begins to yield. Not because you've done any specific physical exercise to reduce it, but because the deeper cause of that tension, the constant state of alert generated by living in internal contradiction, has begun to resolve itself. Your breathing changes, your posture changes, your physical presence in space changes in a way that people around you perceive before they can articulate exactly what's different. You stop reacting with the same automaticity as before to stimuli that used to destabilize you, not because you've become insensitive, but because there's more space between the stimulus and your response, more presence, more ability to choose how you respond. And that extra fraction of a second of awareness between what happens and what you do with what happens is the difference between living as a reactive spectator of your own life and living as its conscious in the external world. The changes that follow this inner transformation have a different quality than those that occur when circumstances are manipulated from the outside. They have the quality of the organic, of what grows, because the internal conditions are right for it to grow, not of the forced that exists, as long as someone pushes it, but collapses as soon as they stop to so. People who resonate with who you are being at this deeper level begin to appear in your life more frequently. Situations that align with who you genuinely are instead of who you pretended to be begin to present themselves with a regularity that is surprising at first, but has a perfect logic. It's not magic, it's resonance. It's the fundamental principle that what you emit at the deepest frequency of your being is what the field of your experience organizes around you. When your word is born from truth, when there's no distance between what you say and who you are, when your declaration emerges from logos instead of from fear disguised as hope, life doesn't obey in the sense that it submits to a master. It responds in the sense that an ecosystem responds to the conditions that allow it to express its fullest nature. And that response has a consistency and depth that no superficial technique can imitate, because no superficial technique has access to the level where true causality. There's a mistake most people make who take the power of words, a mistake so common and so well disguised as genuine spiritual practice, it's almost impossible to detect from within the error itself. It's not a content error. It's not about choosing the wrong words or formulating intentions incorrectly. It's an error of origin. It's the mistake of speaking without inhabiting, of uttering correct words from a place of absence, of building the perfect verbal architecture on the quicksand of a presence that isn't really there. You can repeat the most powerful phrase that has ever been uttered in all of human history. You can articulate it with perfect diction, with the right rhythm, with the intonation that creates resonance. And if, while you utter it, your mind is partially on your to-do list for this afternoon, or on the worry that you've been dwelling on since this morning, or evaluating whether this is working or not, or in any of the thousands of other places where the human mind can be simultaneously with complete ease. That perfect phrase has no more power than background noise, because the power of the word resides in the presence of the being from which the word emerges. The same combination of sounds spoken by two different people can have qualities that are completely different. It can be a tool for connection or a weapon for distance. It can build trust or erode it. It can convey care or indifference. It can bring life or bring emptiness. The difference is not in the phonetics. It's in whether the speaker is truly present while speaking or simply running a sound production program that has been activated by some stimulus. The ancient masters of all traditions who took seriously the power of sacred language had a set of practices that today would seem excessively slow and excessively demanding in a world where speed has become the supreme value. They spoke little, not out of shyness or lack of something to say, but because they understood that every word spoken without presence was a wasted and also a small erosion of the field of coherence they had cultivated with such care. They chose their words with the same deliberation that a master calligrapher chooses the brush, prepares the ink, and observes the blank sheet before making the first stroke. Every phrase was felt before being spoken, which means there was a moment, however brief, when consciousness fully settled into the present before the sound was released into space, not because they were afraid of saying something wrong, but because they knew that inhabited words are completely different from executed words. That speaking with presence changes not only the effect of words in the external field, but fundamentally the internal experience of the speaker. When you speak with genuine presence, something in your body responds immediately. Your breathing settles on its own, your voice drops a bit in tone, it becomes slower, firmer, more real. The tension that usually resides in your neck and jaw area slightly eases your energetic field, that invisible yet perfectly real zone of influence that surrounds every living being. It compacts, becomes denser, more coherent, more impossible to ignore by the organisms and systems around it. Your interlocutor, if there is one, notices it in their body before processing it in their mind. And if the word is directed at your own field, your own inner reality, the deepest layers of your being which respond to the authority of the Logos, those layers also notice it. The practice that transforms this silent error isn't complex, but it does demand a quality of attention that our culture rarely trains. Before speaking, especially when what you're about to say matters, when what you're about to declare intends to shift something in the field of your reality, take an instant, not a minute, not 30 seconds, nor any duration that could become a new technique to execute. Just an instant. The instant is enough for your attention to fully return to where your body is, for you to feel the weight of your body in the chair or on the floor, for you to notice the air entering and leaving, for the consciousness that is normally fragmented between past and future and various possible scenarios and judgments about what's happening, to return to the only place where it can make real contact with reality, the present, and from that instant of recovered presence, speak. That difference between speaking from absence and speaking from presence is the difference between seeds scattered to the wind and seeds carefully placed in the earth. The first have the same genetic composition as the second. They contain the same potential within them. One will find the conditions that allow it to germinate, and the other. The soil of presence is what determines if the seed that is your word will find the conditions to become reality. We have explored the origin of the word's power in humanity's oldest tradition. We have honestly examined the problem of inconsistency that neutralizes that power in most people. We've understood where Jesus spoke from and what made his words a declaration, not a plea, a recognition of eternal order, not a request. We have practiced the movements that bring consciousness to the place from which the powerful word emerges, and we have identified the silent error of absence that can empty even the most perfectly formulated words. Now we arrive at the point where all this converges, not in more knowledge, but in direct experience. There is an understanding that cannot be fully transmitted through words, that can be pointed to, indicated, shown with all the precision that language allows, but that ultimately has to be lived directly so that knowledge ceases to be information about something and becomes recognition of something. That understanding is this: you don't need to learn new words. You don't need to find correct formulas, nor the appropriate sacred vocabulary, nor the precise combination of intentions that guarantees you the desired result. You need to become the Word. And that is not a poetic metaphor. It is an exact description of what happened in Jesus and what the tradition that transmitted it tried to preserve when it said that the Logos became flesh. The Word made flesh is not a miracle that happened only once in history and has since remained inaccessible. It is a description of a process that can occur in any conscious being who brings their internal coherence to the point where there is no longer a distance between what they are and what they say, where being and word are one, where the life expressing itself through you and the words you speak come from the same source, without interruption, without filtration, without the distortion introduced by doubt, fear, or the need for things to be other than they are. Jesus didn't have power because he said the right words. He had power because he was completely consistent with what he said. There was no gap between his identity and his expression. There was no double message, one visible to the world and another whispered in the darkness of his mind. There was no hidden agenda behind his public statements. Every word he uttered came from the totality of his being, moving in a single direction. And that unity, that seamless coherence, is what made reality respond not as one who obeys by force, but as one who recognizes its own order being named. Now, in this very moment, as these words continue to reach you, do the following. Breathe slowly, not a controlled or technical breath, but a breath you allow to happen completely, reaching deep into your abdomen and exiting without haste. Feel the ground beneath your body. Feel the weight of your body responding to gravity with the same trust with which it has responded to it every day of your life, without you having to ask it to. And from that place of complete physical presence, without moving your lips, in the inner space that is the origin of every word before it becomes sound, utter this: I am presence, not as an affirmation of something you wish to be, but as a recognition, something you already are, before any story about what you are. Breathe again and feel those words, not as a concept, to add to your collection of spiritual ideas, but as an experience happening right now in the only place where experience can occur now. From that same place of presence, you've begun to reclaim, inwardly utter this second declaration. Word is born from truth. Feel the weight of that phrase, not the weight of not responsibility, but the weight of certainty, the weight of something that doesn't need to be proven, because it exists before any proof. The calm that accompanies things that are true with regardless of whether someone believes them or not. And finally, the third declaration, the one that integrates the previous two and brings them to their most complete expression. My voice is aligned with life. Remain in that space for as long as you need, without analyzing, without evaluating if you're doing it right, without comparing this experience to any previous or imagined experience. Just be, just feel, just allow what moves to move. What happens in that instant can be subtle. It can be a small feeling of settling, like when an object that was slightly tilted returns to its vertical position. It can be a different quality of inner silence, more dense, more present, more real. It can simply be the momentary absence of the usual noise, that instant when the internal dialogue stops and there is only pure presence before thoughts resume their ordinary movement. It can be something broader and more difficult to describe, something that the masters of the contemplative tradition calls recognition. That instant where something that was always true about who you are is seen directly for the first time, without the veil of personal history getting in the way. Any of these experiences, from the most subtle to the most profound, is the Logos recognizing itself through you, is the word remembering its origin, is the being that you are claiming the authority that was always its own. Because the power of the word that transforms reality doesn't come from learning more sophisticated techniques, nor from accumulating higher knowledge. It comes from removing everything that prevents what you already are from fully expressing itself. And that process of removal, that inverse archaeology, which consists of removing layers instead of adding content, simplifying instead of complicating, returning instead of advancing. That is the path Jesus pointed out, and that the Logos has written from the beginning within every being who has the courage to listen to themselves with enough depth. And if you've made it this far, it's not a coincidence. Something within you was ready to remember, ready to understand that your voice isn't an accident, that your words aren't insignificant, that every phrase you utter is a seed that falls into the invisible field of your reality. Today you didn't learn anything new. You remembered something ancient, something that was always with you. The ability to speak from truth, the ability to declare from consciousness, the ability to live as a conscious creator and not a spectator of destiny. This space exists for awakening souls, for those who feel that life has a deeper language, for those who know that words can heal, order, transform. If this message resonated with you, I invite you to become part of this community. Subscribe and walk alongside others who are learning to remember who they are. And if you feel in your heart the desire to support this space, you can do so through a super chat as a gentle and conscious way to keep this teaching alive. Now, before we close, seal this moment with a phrase. Write it in the comments, like someone leaving an energetic imprint. My reality listens to my voice, because when you speak from truth, your reality begins to obey.